Chapter 1. A Stranger in the Dust. The sun was a cruel overseer that day, burning the prairie into waves of gold and copper. Heat shimmered above the dry earth, and the horses beneath the cowboys groaned with every step, their hides slick with sweat. Spurs clinked in lazy rhythm, the men half drifting in their saddles, eager for shade and whiskey in the town that waited 2 days' ride north. It was Ezekiel who spotted her first. "Hell's fire, what's that?" he muttered, pulling the brim of his hat low to shield his eyes. All heads turned toward the horizon. There, where the dust danced in the air, a lone figure staggered across the wasteland. She moved like a broken marionette, half falling, half stumbling, her pale dress torn and clotted with a dark stain spreading at the waist. "Looks like trouble," another cowboy grunted. "Best let buzzards handle it." Ethan Calloway squinted, jaw tight. He wasn't the sort to waste words, but his eyes fixed on her long after the others had turned away. She collapsed to her knees, hands clawed at the sand as though digging for water that wasn't there. "She's done for," Ezekiel said, spitting into the dirt. "Ain't our problem." The group urged their mounts forward, dust swirling behind them, all except Ethan. He reined in his horse, leather creaking, heart thundering louder than the cicadas that filled the still air. Something in him, some half-buried instinct he thought long dead, refused to let her die alone in the dirt. "Damn it," he hissed under his breath. He kicked his boots free of the stirrups and swung down, boots crunching into the parched ground. Each step carried the smell of heat-baked sagebrush and blood-soaked dust. By the time he reached her, she was trying to crawl forward, her breath ragged like a horse pushed too far. "Easy there," Ethan murmured, his voice low, steady. He dropped to one knee, slipping an arm beneath her shoulders. Her skin burned fever-hot beneath his touch. She blinked up at him, eyes glazed but fierce, pupils like pools of storm water. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Don't let them find me." Then she went limp in his arms. Ethan stared at her bloodied side, the bullet wound cruel and raw. He pressed his hand against the torn fabric, feeling the hot stickiness seep between his fingers. "You've got grit, lady," he muttered, "but grit alone won't keep you alive." Behind him, the others called out, their voices sharp with impatience. "Leave her, Calloway. You'll get yourself killed along with her. She's likely mixed in with trouble you don't want." Ethan rose slowly, the woman cradled against him. She was light, far too light, as though hardship had carved away everything but bone and willpower. He carried her toward his horse, dust swirling at his boots like the earth itself whispered against the choice he'd made. "You're a damn fool, Ethan," Ezekiel barked. "Ain't no woman worth dying for in this country." Ethan shot him a look over his shoulder, the kind that could cut through iron. "Maybe not to you." He lifted her carefully onto his horse, then swung up behind, one arm wrapped firmly around her waist to steady her. The mare shifted under the weight, but Ethan's grip was sure, his will unshaken. The prairie stretched endless before them, miles of dust, danger, and silence, but Ethan felt a strange clarity. The woman's whispered plea still echoed in his ears, mingling with the far-off cry of a coyote greeting the dying sun. She was running from something, no doubt. Man who'd put that bullet in her gut would come riding fast and hard. But he couldn't turn back now. With a nudge of his heels, Ethan steered his horse toward the distant line of scrub and the promise of water. He glanced down at her face, pale and fragile against the fiery horizon, and something twisted in his chest he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, Ethan Calloway had more than just himself to keep alive. And as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in blood and fire, he knew one truth as certain as the dust clinging to his boots. The West was merciless, but so was he when it came to keeping a promise, even one made in a dying woman's whisper. Chapter 2. The Waterhole. The ride to the watering hole felt longer than it was. The woman slumped against Ethan's chest, her breath shallow, each exhale a ragged rasp against his shirt. The desert stretched endless in every direction, a sea of dust and silence, broken only by the creak of leather and the steady clop of hooves. Ethan's horse snorted as they crested a rise, and at last a glint of water appeared, small, muddy, but enough to keep life clinging. A cluster of mesquite and scrub willow bent low around the pool, the only shade for miles. He dismounted in a single motion, careful not to jostle her more than he had to. She groaned when his arm slid from around her, and the sound hit him harder than a bullet. "Stay with me," he muttered, lowering her gently into grasp by the edge of the pool. The smell of stagnant water and sun-baked earth filled the air. The others arrived a minute later, their horses kicking up dust. Ezekiel spat into ground, his face twisted in disgust. "You're wasting your time, Calloway. Ain't no patching a hole like that. Best to let her go easy." Ethan ignored him. He yanked off his neckerchief, dipped in the water, and pressed it against her wound. She flinched, a sharp gasp escaping her cracked lips. Her eyelids fluttered open, and for the first time Ethan saw more than pain there. Fear, raw and trembling, but mixed with stubborn that hadn't given out yet. "Water," she croaked. He held a canteen to her lips, tipping it just enough to wet them without choking her. She drank greedily, coughing afterward, then whispered, "Thank you." Ethan nodded once, unsmiling. His hands worked fast and sure as he reached into his saddlebag for a flask of whiskey and a strip of linen he'd torn from an old shirt. He poured the liquor over the wound. She cried out, biting down hard on her lip, eyes flashing. "Damn cruel," she hissed between gasps. "Cruel's the only thing that'll keep the rot off you," Ethan said, voice like gravel. He bound her as best he could, the linen soaking red almost at once. Behind him, one of the cowboys cursed. "Ethan, you're going to get us all killed. Whoever put that lead in her ain't going to just let her wander off. They'll track her here, and then what?" "Then we shoot straighter than they do," Ethan said without looking up. The men muttered among themselves, shifting uneasy in their saddles, but none dared press him further. They knew the tone in his voice, the kind that came from a man who'd already decided. The woman's hand caught his wrist, startling him. Her fingers were weak but insistent. Why help me?" Ethan met her gaze. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds, wild and unbroken despite the blood that stained her dress. He thought of giving her a dozen answers, but the truth slipped out plain. "Because you asked me to," he said. Something passed between them then, something quieter than words, more binding than rope. She blinked at him, and for a heartbeat the fear in her eyes softened, replaced by something dangerously close to trust. The desert wind stirred the mesquite, carrying with it the distant howl of a coyote. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the waterhole. Ethan tightened the bandage and eased her head back against the grass. "Rest," he said. "You'll need your strength when the riders come." Her lips parted, as though she wanted to argue, but exhaustion claimed her first. Her breathing steadied, shallow but even. Ethan sat back on his heels, wiped the sweat and blood from his hands on his trousers, and scanned the horizon. The sky stretched wide and merciless above them, but he felt the weight of something new pressing on his shoulders. Responsibility, heavy and alive, for better or worse. He'd tied himself to her now, and in the Wild West, a promise like that was as good as a death warrant or salvation. Chapter 3, Whispers and Warnings. Night draped itself over the desert like a black shroud, the stars sharp as flint above. The cowboys had set their campfire a little ways off from the waterhole, its orange glow flickering against tired faces and the restless hides of their horses. The air carried the dry bite of mesquite smoke, and somewhere beyond the circle of light, a coyote barked his hunger into the night. Ethan sat a little apart from the others, his rifle across his knees, his eyes on the woman. She lay wrapped in a blanket near the fire, her breathing uneven but stronger than before. Each time she shifted, a low moan slipped past her lips, and Ethan's jaw tightened. He hated the sound, not because it wearied him, but because it reminded him how close she had walked to death. The others weren't so merciful. "Don't like it," muttered Caleb, running a whetstone down his knife. "She's marked, Ethan. Any fool can see it. Men don't shoot a woman in the gut unless they're meaning to silence her for good." Ezekiel grunted agreement. "And we're sitting here, fat ducks waiting for the hawks. You should have left her where you found her." Ethan said nothing at first. He tipped his hat lower, the firelight catching the shadow of his stubbled jaw. The silence stretched so long the men thought he hadn't heard. Then he said, quiet but iron-hard, "She asked for help. That was enough." The whetstone stopped mid-stroke. Caleb stared at him, mouth working, but whatever he saw in Ethan's face killed his reply. From the blanket, a hoarse voice broke the tension. "Don't blame them," the woman rasped. Her eyelids fluttered, half moons in the firelight. "They're right. I bring danger." Ethan moved closer, crouching beside her. "Danger finds us all soon enough. Might as well look in the eye." Her lips trembled, caught between laughter and tears. "You don't know what you're risking." She swallowed hard, her voice barely more than smoke. "Name's Clara. Clara Hayes. I worked at the Silver Spur Saloon down in Elkhorn." At that, the men stirred uneasily. Everyone had heard of the Silver Spur. Its owner, Nathaniel Pike, was the kind of man who smiled while he slit your throat. Clara's hands clenched at the blanket. "I wasn't no lady of the rooms," she said quickly, pride flashing through her pain. "I served whiskey, cleaned up after their card games, kept my head down. But one night, I heard too much." Her eyes flicked toward Ethan, storm-dark. He was dealing guns under the table, talking with outlaws, smugglers. They laughed, said they'd carve the whole territory bloody. I tried to slip away quiet, but Pike, he caught me. She lifted a shaky hand toward her bandaged side, told me I'd be dead by dawn. I ran. The fire popped, spitting sparks into the night. For a moment no one spoke. The crackle of burning would fill the silence. Finally, Ezekiel swore under his breath. "You hear that, Calloway? That ain't some lover spat. That's Pike's business. He'll send a pack of wolves to sniff her out. And if we're standing near her when they come..." Ethan's gaze never left Clara. She was trembling now, but not from the cold. He reached out, pulling the blanket higher over her shoulders, his hand steady, deliberate. "If Pike wants her," Ethan said, "he'll have to ride through me first." The words dropped like a hammer in the circle of men. Clara's eyes widened, and for the first time since he'd found her bleeding in the dust, something softened in them. Gratitude, a fragile, dangerous spark of hope. The others shifted, muttering. No one dared challenge Ethan outright. He had that look in his eye again, the look of a man who'd buried too many regrets and wouldn't stomach another. The fire burned lower. Clara's breathing steadied, her storm-dark eyes lingering on the man who had chosen to stand when everyone else turned away. And somewhere out in the vast black night, carried faint on the wind, the echo of distant hoofbeats stirred the silence. Chapter 4, Blood on the Trail. The horizon was just beginning to pale when Ethan's eyes snapped open. Dawn crept slow across the prairie, painting the sky in strokes of ash and rose. He had dozed in the dirt with his rifle across his lap, but it wasn't the light that woke him. It was the faint tremor in the earth. Hoofbeats, distant but coming fast. He rose in one fluid motion, scanning the horizon. Dark specks broke the edge of morning, growing larger by the second. Riders, half a dozen at least, maybe more. He felt his gut tighten like a cinched saddle. "Up!" he barked, kicking Ezekiel's boot. "They're here." The camp stirred to frantic life. Men cursed. Horses whinnied. Coffee spilled into the fire. Clara woke with a jolt, clutching her side, eyes wide with the kind of terror only hunted creatures knew. "They've found me," she whispered. Ethan crouched beside her, his voice low but firm. "You hold on, you hear? Ain't no bullet or bastard taking you while I draw breath." She nodded, pale but resolute, her fingers clutching the edge of his coat, as though drawing strength from the rough fabric. The first shots rang out before the sun had fully cleared the rim of the earth. Bullets hissed into the camp, one striking sparks off a skillet, another tearing through a saddlebag. The cowboys scattered for cover, rifles barking in answer. Ethan shoved Clara down behind a log, then swung his Winchester to his shoulder. He sighted quick and clean, dropping the lead rider from his saddle with a crack that echoed across the valley. Dust swallowed the man as his horse bolted riderless. Gunfire exploded in a chaos of thunder. Horses screamed. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air, and the world shrank to smoke and blood. "Fall back!" Ezekiel shouted, reloading with shaking hands. "They'll overrun us." Ethan's jaw clenched. He fired again, another rider pitching backward. Still more came, dark shapes against the burning sunrise. Clara clutched the log, her face pale, breath coming fast. "Go!" she cried. "Leave me or they'll kill you too." Ethan snapped back, his voice like steel striking flint. "Ain't in me to leave a woman for wolves." A bullet whined past his head, close enough to tug his hat brim. He spat into the dust, rage and focus tightening every muscle. Then, in the split of chaos, he saw it, the gap. The riders were circling too wide, leaving the north flank open. He grabbed Clara's arm. "On your feet. We ride." She stumbled, but he caught her, sweeping her up into his arms as though she weighed no more than a sack of grain. With a grunt, he threw her across his horse's saddle, swung up behind, and dug his spurs in. The mare screamed and lunged forward, hooves tearing at the earth. "Calloway!" someone shouted behind him, but the cry was lost in the thunder of pursuit. Ethan bent low over Clara, one arm wrapped tight around her waist, the other steady on the reins. The wind whipped his face, carrying the sting of smoke and dust. Behind, riders gave chase, their shouts cruel and hungry. Clara twisted weakly in his grip, whispering, "You'll die for me?" Ethan's mouth was a grim line as he urged the mare harder, the sun bleeding fire across the sky. "Maybe," he said, breath ragged, "but not today." The chase tore across the plain, dust rising like a storm behind them. A shot cracked, grazing the mare's flank. The horse stumbled, then recovered, fear lending her speed. Ethan turned in the saddle, firing blind, his bullet catching one pursuer square. The man toppled, the other scattering just enough to buy them distance. At last, the gunfire faded, swallowed by the wind. Ethan didn't slow until the horizon was clear again, until the only sound was the pounding of the mare's heart and Clara's soft, pain breathing against his chest. They rode into the sunrise, the sky awash in blood-red light, and Ethan knew the fight wasn't over, but she was alive, still breathing, still as to protect, and that was enough to keep him riding. Chapter 5, Shelter at the Ranch. By the time Ethan's ranch came into view, the sun had dipped low, bleeding gold across the endless prairie. The land stretched bare and lonely, broken only by a weather-beaten cabin, a sagging barn, and the crooked outline of a corral where two horses lifted their heads at the sound of approaching hooves. The place looked as though the wind itself had been gnawing at it for years, but to Ethan it was home. He reined in slow, dust curling around the mare's legs as she skidded to a stop. Clara stirred against him, her head heavy on his chest. Her lips were cracked, her skin pale as bone china, but her eyes fluttered open long enough to see the cabin. "This is yours," she rasped. Ethan slid down and caught her in his arms before she could fall. "What's left of it," he said. His boots thudded against the porch boards as he carried her inside. The cabin smelled of cedar and old smoke, the air cool after the furnace of the desert. A single window let in the last light of day, dust motes swirling in golden beams. Ethan laid her gently on his bed, a rough-hewn frame, the quilt faded but clean. She sank into it with a sigh, her lashes trembling against her cheeks. He lit a lamp, the flame flickering across his sharp features, then fetched water from a basin. "You rest here," he said firmly. "Ain't much, but it'll hold you better than the dirt." Clara gave a weak laugh that turned into a cough. "Better than most places I've had to lay my head." Ethan dipped a rag in the water and wrung it out, then pressed it to her forehead. His big hands, usually so hard and sure with reins or rifles, moved careful as a prayer. She watched him, her storm-dark eyes softening despite the pain. "You tend wounds like a doctor," she whispered. He shook his head. "Just a man who's seen too many of 'em." Her gaze lingered on him, and for a moment the silence between them was heavier than words. Ethan busied himself with the bandages, unwrapping the makeshift cloth from earlier and replacing it with cleaner linen. She winced as he pulled the fabric tight. "Sorry," he muttered. "You've done more for me than anyone ever has," Clara said, her voice trembling but clear. "Why?" Ethan paused, his hand still on the knot he was tying. He looked at her then, really looked, at the stubborn tilt of her chin, even through weakness, the fire in her eyes that hadn't been snuffed out by pain or fear. "'Cause I couldn't ride past," he said simply. The room went quiet except for the tick of the lamp. Outside, the prairie wind rattled the shutters, and a lone coyote howled somewhere far off. Clara closed her eyes, and when she spoke again, her words were softer, almost afraid. "You'll bring Pike's men on yourself. They won't stop till I'm dead." Ethan straightened, his shadow long on the wall. "Let 'em come. This ranch has seen worse than Pike's dogs. And I ain't in the habit of handing over the helpless." Her eyes open again, glistening in the lamplight. "I'm not helpless." The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Reckon I can see that." She held his gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then her lashes lowered, and exhaustion pulled her under once more. Ethan sat back in the lone chair, rifle propped at his side, and kept watch as night swallowed the prairie. His ranch had always been quiet, filled with nothing but wind and silence. But tonight, with Clara breathing steady in his bed, the place felt less empty. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, gunfire, blood, maybe worse. But for now, in the fragile hush of his cabin, Ethan Calloway let himself feel the dangerous warmth of something he hadn't dared touch in years. Hope. Chapter 6, A Saloon Shadow. By the third day, Clara's color had begun to return. She could sit up against the headboard without swaying, though the wound still pulled at her every breath. Ethan had watched her stubbornly push through the pain, refusing to be seen as weak. It stirred something in him he couldn't quite name, something that gnawed at him even as he saddled his horse that morning. "I'll be gone a spell," he told her, cinching the girth tight. "Need supplies, more bandages, more whiskey, cartridges." Clara sat in the doorway, blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. The morning light painted her face pale, but her eyes were steady. "If you ride into town, they'll know. Pike's man, he's got eyes everywhere." Ethan swung up into the saddle, the leather creaking. "I've never been one for hiding. Don't reckon I'll start now." He touched his brim to her, then kicked his mare into motion, dust trailing behind him across the prairie. Elkhorn was alive when he rode in, wagon wheels groaning down Main Street. Children darting barefoot across the boardwalks, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoing like a heartbeat. But under the bustle there was a tension, a low hum Ethan felt in his bones. eyes followed him as he dismounted, tying his mare outside the general store. Inside, the air smelled of flour and kerosene. Old Man Porter barely looked up from behind the counter as Ethan gathered what he needed: rolls of linen, 2 bottles of whiskey, a sack of beans. But when Ethan slapped down coins, Porter finally met his gaze, voice low. Word is, Pike's got a reward on something, or someone. A girl, they say. You wouldn't know nothing about that, would you, Calloway? Ethan's jaw tightened. He swept the supplies into his saddlebag. I mind my own business. Porter's eyes flicked to the door. Best keep it that way. Men been a skin about you. Ethan stepped outside, and sure enough, trouble was waiting. 3 men leaned against the hitching post across the street. Dust coats pulled back just enough to show the glint of iron at their hips. They watched him with wolfish grins, their spurs jingling faint as they shifted. Calloway, one drawled, spitting tobacco into the dirt. Word is you been riding with company. A lady. Can't say Pike takes kindly to thieves keeping what belongs to him. Ethan's hand brushed above his coat, slow, deliberate. Ain't no man owns a woman. Not out here. The leader's grin widened. Then hand her over. Save yourself a bullet. The boardwalk creaked as townsfolk paused to listen, tension thick as summer heat. Ethan let the silence stretch, his eyes hard under the brim of his hat. Then he said, quiet as a knife sliding free of its sheath, best you tell Pike if he wants her back. He'll have to dig me out of the dirt first. The man's grin faltered, just a flicker, but it was enough. He spat again, then jerked his head. Come on, boys. This ain't the place. They swaggered off toward the saloon, their spurs ringing sharp against the planks. But Ethan knew the message was clear. Pike's shadow had already reached Elkhorn by the time he rode back to the ranch. The sun was melting into the horizon, painting the sky in crimson and ash. Clara was waiting by the window, her face pale, but her eyes sharp. You went into the lion's den, she whispered when he carried the supplies inside. Lion didn't bite, Ethan said, setting the whiskey on the table. But he's sniffing close. Clara's hands trembled around the blanket. You should have left me, Ethan. You'd still have peace. He looked at her then, the firelight catching the scar that ran along his jaw, the weight of old battles in his eyes. Peace don't mean a damn thing if it costs a good woman her life. She held his gaze, lips parting as though to argue, but no words came. For the first time, she realized this man wasn't saving her out of duty alone. Something deeper bound him to her now. And outside, far across the prairie, a lone rider carried word back to Pike. Calloway wasn't letting go. Chapter 7, Showdown at Sundown. The sun was already bleeding into the horizon when Ethan knew the storm had arrived. The prairie sky glowed orange and red, long shadows spilling across the dry earth like spilled ink. From the porch of his ranch, he could see them. Dark riders cresting the ridge, a dozen at least, the dust of their horses rising like smoke. Clara stood inside the doorway, one hand braced against a frame for balance. She was pale but steady, her storm-gray eyes locked on the approaching figures. They found us, she said quietly. Ethan chambered a round into his Winchester, the sound sharp in the still evening. They were always coming. Best we face it on our own ground. Clara stepped onto the porch, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. Her wound still pulled at her, but she stood tall. I won't hide while you bleed for me. Ethan turned, his eyes meeting hers. The sunset caught his face in hard lines, but his voice softened. You're not a fighter. Then teach me to be, she said, and for a heartbeat he almost smiled. But there was no time. The riders fanned out, forming a crescent at the edge of the ranch. At their center sat Nathaniel Pike, broad-shouldered, his black hat pulled low, his smile cold as steel. Calloway. Pike's voice carried across the distance, slick and poisonous. "You've got something of mine. Hand her over, and maybe I'll leave you breathing." Ethan stepped forward, rifle resting easy in his hands. "Ain't no man owns her. You want her, you'll have to take her." The gang laughed, the sound harsh and ugly. Pike raised his hand, and the world went still. Then it dropped. Gunfire split the air. Bullets screamed past, slamming into the ranch walls, kicking up splinters. Ethan dropped to one knee, firing back with calm precision. One rider pitched from his horse. Another reeled with a cry. Clara ducked behind the porch post, her hands shaking as she clutched a revolver Ethan had pressed into her palm. "Only fire if you have to," he had told her. "But don't hesitate if the time comes." The ranch yard became chaos. Horses shrieking, men shouting, smoke choking the last light of day. Ethan moved like a man born to battle. Every shot measured, every motion sure. Clara watched, her heart pounding with terror and awe. But then she saw it. One of Pike's men slipping around the side of the barn, rifle leveled at Ethan's back. Without thinking, she raised her revolver. Her hands trembled, but she pulled the trigger. The gun bucked, the shot cracked, and the man stumbled, his aim spoiled, his bullet burying harmlessly in the dirt. Ethan spun, finished the job with a clean shot, then looked at her. For a moment, their eyes locked through the smoke and dust, her face stricken his unreadable. Then he gave a single nod, wordless approval that sent warmth surging through her fear. The fight dragged on, the sun sinking lower, painting the battlefield in fire. At last only Pike remained, his men scattered in the dust. He dismounted slow, his smile gone, his pistol gleaming. "You've made a fool's choice, Calloway," he spat. "One woman's not worth dying for." Ethan stepped forward, blood seeping from a graze along his arm, his stance steady. "Maybe not to you, but to me, she's worth every bullet I've got." The word struck Clara like a brand to her heart. The two men faced each other, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder and blood. The silence stretched, broken only by the call of a distant crow. Then Pike drew, fast but not fast enough. Ethan's rifle roared. Pike staggered, his pistol clattering to the ground before he crumpled into the dirt, the sunset burning above him. The world went still. Only the whisper of the prairie wind remained. Ethan lowered his rifle, chest heaving. Clara ran to him, catching his face in her trembling hands. He was bleeding, battered, but alive. "You fool," she whispered, tears shining in her eyes. "You should have left me." He caught her wrist, pressed her palm against his jaw. His voice was low, rough as gravel but steady as the earth. Didn't want to." Then she kissed him, fierce and desperate, the taste of gunpowder and tears between them. And in that burning moment, with bodies cooling in the dust around them and the prairie bathed in blood-red light, they both knew their fight had bound them together tighter than any vow spoken in peace. Chapter 8. A New Dawn. The prairie was quiet after the storm. Smoke still drifted in thin ribbons from the barn, mingling with the faint metallic tang of gunpowder that lingered in the cooling night air. The bodies of Pike's men lay scattered where they had fallen, their shadows long and stiff in the moonlight. Coyotes would come before long, but Ethan was too weary to care. Inside the cabin, the lamp burned low, casting a soft amber glow over the room. Ethan sat at the edge of the bed, his shirt sleeve torn and his arm wrapped in a strip of linen Clara had tied herself. He'd insisted it was nothing but a scratch, though the blood had told a harsher truth. Clara, pale but resolute, had tended him with hands that still trembled from the fight. "You're a stubborn man," she said at last, breaking the silence. Her voice was hoarse, but there was a gentleness in it too. "Could have let me go. Save yourself all this." Ethan looked at her, the shadows cutting deep across his rugged features. His eyes, though tired, burned steady. Ain't in me to walk past what's worth savant. Clara swallowed hard, her storm-gray gaze holding his. And you think I'm worth savant? He leaned back, the old chair groaning under his weight, and for a moment the silence stretched between them like the vast plains outside. Then he said, quiet but certain, I know it. Clara lowered her eyes, the flicker of the lamplight catching on the tears that threatened. For years, she'd been nothing more than a shadow in the saloon, a name whispered by men who never cared to know her. Yet here sat a man who had bled for her, faced death for her, without ever asking for a thing in return. She reached across the quilt, her fingers brushing his rough hand. I thought I'd die out there in the dust, she whispered. But you carried me back to life. Ethan's hand closed around hers, firm and steady. He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes said more than words ever could. Morning came slow and golden. The first rays of sunlight spilled over the horizon, turning the prairie into a sea of fire-tipped grass. Clara stepped onto the porch, the blanket draped over her shoulders, the air still cool against her skin. The world felt new, washed clean after blood and smoke. Ethan followed, his limp slight but noticeable, his hat pulled low against the rising sun. He stood beside her, silent for a long while, staring out at the wide-open land. It's yours, you know, he said finally, nodding toward the endless sweep of prairie, the cabin, the barn leaning stubbornly against the wind. All I've got to my name. Ain't much, but honest. Clara turned to him, surprise flickering in her eyes. Why tell me that? He shifted, clearing his throat, suddenly uneasy in a way bullets had never made him. 'Cause I reckon I don't want it to be just mine anymore. The words hung in the morning air, heavier than any gunshot. Clara's heart thudded, her breath catching. She searched his face, the hard lines carved by years of loneliness, the scars that spoke of battles fought, but also the quiet tenderness he tried to hide. Slowly, she stepped closer, laying her hand on his chest. His heartbeat thudded beneath her palm, strong and steady. You don't have to be alone anymore, she said softly. Ethan caught her chin, lifting her face to his. His thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. Then, without hesitation, he kissed her. It wasn't desperate like the one they'd shared in the smoke of battle. It was slow, certain, a promise written in the language of touch. When they finally broke apart, the prairie stretched endless before them, a canvas painted in gold and blue. The past lay buried in dust and blood, but ahead, there was something worth building. Clara leaned into him, her head against his shoulder, the blanket slipping free as the sun climbed higher. Ethan's arm wrapped around her, holding her steady as if he'd never let go. Together they stood at the threshold of a new day, two souls bound not by chance, but by choice. The sun sagged low, spilling fire across the endless plains. Dust shimmered gold in the dying light, and the faint hum of a saloon piano drifted from town on the wind, mixing with the sharp, clean scent of sagebrush. Ethan sat his horse at the ridge above his ranch, Clara beside him, her hair loose, catching the breeze like a banner of freedom. The battle was behind them, pike buried, his men scattered to the wind. The ranch still bore scars, bullet holes in the siding, smoke stains on the barn, but it stood. And so did they. Clara turned to him, her storm-gray eyes softer now, filled not with fear, but with quiet resolve. I spent my whole life belonging to someone else's world, she said, voice trembling with truth. But with you, Ethan, I reckon I can finally belong to my own. Ethan's hand closed over hers, callous and sure. His gaze lingered on the horizon, then back to her. Then let's build something worth belonging to, right here. You and me. The wind tugged at his hat brim, carrying their silence like a vow. Clara leaned in, her forehead resting against his, tears catching the corner of her eyes. Whatever comes, she whispered, we face it together. Ethan kissed her, slow and certain, as the last light of day bled into night. Two riders against a wide, untamed west, no longer running, no longer alone. And for the first time, the prairie felt like home. And in the stillness of that dawn, the west no longer felt so merciless.